That was delightful testimony you gave me earlier on with your speech. But hey, that's fine. You can say what you like. I don't care, because that's what free speech is. And in a sense, this has all been going wrong now for a couple of decades. We've kind of forgotten the Voltairean principle.
You just heard Nigel Farage get hit with the smear package, and his response is basically, say whatever you want, I do not care, because that is free speech. That is the tell. One side needs labels and panic, the other side just lets you talk. Hey y'all, welcome in. How are you doing today? This is Saha Explains. Hit like, drop your take in the comments, and subscribe, because the full exchange is even uglier once Jamie Raskin really starts loading the premise. Now watch how this starts.
I imagine that in a hearing about threats to freedom of speech abroad, we might hear from a Russian dissident about Putin's massive violations of political freedom, or the death of Alexei Navalny in prison, or maybe a journalist about the Saudi Crown Prince's assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post writer who demanded freedom from religious persecution and oppression in Saudi Arabia. But no, the dictators of the world have got nothing to fear from this hearing. The Republicans called it to...
Listen to the posture. Raskin is not here to discuss free speech policy. He is here to declare the hearing illegitimate before the witness even speaks. This is built for clips, not for answers.
To attack our democratic allies in Europe. The star witness is not a human rights leader like Navalny, but a far-right, pro-Putin politician who leads the UK Reform Party, a party that has 4 members out of 650 members in the parliament. He calls England an authoritarian regime. For a man who fashions himself as some kind of a free speech martyr, Mr. Farage seems most at home with the autocrats and dictators of the world who are crushing freedom on earth. To the people of UK who think this Putin-loving free speech imposter and Trump sycophant will protect freedom in your country, come on over to America and see what Trump and MAGA are doing to destroy our freedom, kidnap college students off the street, ban books from our libraries, militarize our police and unleash them against our communities, take over our universities, wreck our professional civil service, and turn the government into a money-making machine for Trump and his family. You might think twice before you let Mr. Farage make Britain great again.
There it is. He cannot argue the free speech point, so he tries to set the room on fire with pro-Putin, far-right, Trump sycophant, and then he does a whole anti-Trump infomercial inside a hearing. That is not oversight. That is a hit job with a gavel nearby.
The Right Honourable Member of Parliament, Mr. Farage, is recognized.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Chairman Jordan, for inviting me here today. And it turns out, with news in the last 48 hours, to have been really rather timely. I'm delighted to reacquaint with the charming Mr. Raskin. That was delightful testimony you gave me earlier on with your speech. But hey, that's fine. You can say what you like. I don't care, because that's what free speech is.
Notice what Farage did. He did not whine. He did not beg for permission. He did not ask Raskin to be nicer. He just put a mirror up and said, this is the whole point. You can run your mouth and I am still going to speak.
But in a sense, this has all been going wrong now for a couple of decades. We've kind of forgotten the Voltairean principles that we'll fight and defend to the death your right to say something that we fundamentally disagree with. That is the absolute foundation, if you think about it, of free speech, of democracy, of living in freedom. It's kind of why we fought 2 world wars at massive, massive cost, to defend that very principle for ourselves and for many, many others around the country. And I first became worried about all this with cancel culture. You know, the idea that we can't have this speaker go to a university because some people might be offended by what he or she have to say. It is important to note that there is not a parent in the United Kingdom, and I would guess it's the same for America too, that is not concerned about content their children as minors can find on the internet.
That is what a serious witness sounds like. Not a branding exercise, not a viral moral lecture, just principle and then the very obvious reality. Once you let offended people run the whole show, speech dies fast.
Extraordinary that, I come from the land of Magna Carta, I come from the land that gave us the mother of parliaments, and it doesn't give me any great joy to be sitting in America and describing the really awful authoritarian situation that we have now sunk into. J.D. Vance did us all a service at the Munich Security Conference back in February this year. He really got this debate up and running, and it's a vital one. We've run on since then. The Online Safety Act was put in place by the last Conservative government. I don't doubt for a minute they're good intentions, but sometimes the road to hell is paved with those good intentions. And we are now where we are. We have a couple of very famous cases. We, of course, have Lucy Connolly, who put out an intemperate tweet after the savage murder of those 3 beautiful young girls, she herself, a mother who had lost a child. It was intemperate, it was wrong, but she removed it 3.5 hours later, sentenced to 31 months in prison. She's now out, having served 40% of the time. I wanted to bring her with me today as living proof of what can go wrong. Sadly, the restrictions that have been put on her banned her from making the trip, which is a very, very...
This is where the conversation gets real, and this is exactly why Raskin tried to pre-smear him. Farage is describing what happens when the state decides speech is a public safety problem and then starts making examples out of people.
A great shame. And we, of course, have the extraordinary events that we understood yesterday of Graham Linehan, the comedic writer, and he put out some tweets months ago when he was in Arizona, and months later he arrives at Heathrow Airport to be met by 5 armed police. Armed police, not a big deal in the USA, a very big deal in the United Kingdom. 5 of them. And he was arrested and taken away for questioning. He's not even a British citizen. He's an Irish citizen. This could happen to any American man or woman that goes to Heathrow that has said things online that the British government and British police don't like. It is a potentially big threat to tech bosses, to many, many others. This legislation we've got will damage trade between our countries, threaten free speech across the West because of the knock-on rollout effects of this legislation from us or from the European Union. So I've come today as well to be a klaxon, to say to you, don't allow, piece by piece, this to happen here in America. And you would be doing us and yourselves and all freedom-loving people a favor if your politicians and your businesses said to the British government, you've simply got this wrong. At what point did we become North Korea? Well, I think the Irish comedy writer found that out. This is a genuinely worrying, concerning, and shocking situation, and I thank you for the opportunity to come here.
All right, now that you have actually seen the evidence in order, let us say the quiet part out loud. Jamie Raskin walked into a hearing about threats to free speech abroad, and he did not even pretend to engage the topic honestly. He opened by waving around the names Navalny and Khashoggi, not because he wanted a serious discussion of repression, but because he wanted a moral weapon. That is the move. You invoke dead dissidents and murdered journalists so you can posture as the decent guy, and then you use that borrowed tragedy to blacklist the witness you do not like. And what does he blacklist Nigel Farage with? Not facts, not a point-by-point rebuttal. He goes straight to the modern Democrat starter kit. Far-right, pro-Putin, imposter, Trump sycophant. And then, because he cannot help himself, he hijacks the whole thing into an anti-Trump monologue. Kidnap college students, ban books, militarize police, turn government into a money-making machine. It is a spray of accusations designed to make your brain feel like it heard proof. But here is what Raskin did not do. He did not engage the actual warning that this hearing is about. He did not argue the lines of the Online Safety Act. He did not grapple with what it means when a government starts treating tweets like criminal evidence. He did not touch the principle because he is not trying to win a debate. He is trying to control who is allowed to speak. And if you want to understand the difference between a serious person and a narrative manager, look at Nigel Farage's first response. It was almost boring, and that is why it was powerful. He basically says, I am delighted to see you. You can say what you like. I do not care, because that is what free speech is. That one sentence blows up the whole Raskin approach, because Raskin's entire strategy depends on one thing. It depends on you believing that speech is only legitimate when the right people approve the speaker. That is why he runs to labels. He wants Farage to be seen as contaminated. He wants the audience to hear pro-Putin and stop listening. He wants the room to treat the witness as a hazard instead of a person with an argument. That is not how free speech works. Free speech is not a medal given out by Jamie Raskin. Free speech is not a permission slip from the same people who always swear they are saving democracy while they are trying to police the conversation. Now, I am going to be careful here, because I am not going to pretend we have court documents on every UK case Farage mentioned. In this clip, we have his testimony about Lucy Connolly and his description of Graham Linehan being met by 5 armed police at Heathrow, but even at the level of testimony, the warning is obvious. The state is getting comfortable with the idea that online speech can follow you across borders, into airports, into interrogation rooms, and that is where this stops being a British domestic squabble and starts being a Western problem. Farage says it could happen to any American who goes to Heathrow and has said things the British government and police do not like. That is not some abstract theory. That is him describing a model. And once a model exists, institutions copy it. Bureaucracies share best practices. Regulators talk. And suddenly you have this polite managerial language, online safety, hate incidents, misinformation that turns into a practical system of intimidation. And of course, Raskin wants to bury that conversation. Because if the conversation becomes, do we want governments and allied governments normalizing speech policing, then the Democrat brand takes a hit. The same people who lecture you about threats to democracy end up defending the very cultural machinery that shrinks free speech and then calls it compassion. Watch the structure. Raskin starts by saying, dictators have nothing to fear from this hearing. That is him signaling to the audience, this hearing is a joke, the Republicans are bad actors. Then he says Republicans called it to attack Democratic allies in Europe. That is him reframing scrutiny as betrayal. Then he says the star witness is far right and pro-Putin. That is him declaring, do not listen, just flinch. Then he pivots to Trump and MAGA destroying freedom, like this is a campaign speech. And then he wraps it up by telling the UK not to let Farage make Britain great again, as if this is his personal theater stage. That is not a hearing statement, that is a narrative blockade. Now compare it to what Farage actually did. He thanked Chairman Jim Jordan for inviting him. He framed the issue as a debate about first principles. He acknowledged parental concern about minors online because yes, normal people do care about what kids can access. That is not controversial. Then he goes right into how good intentions can pave the road to something ugly, and he points to cases that, in his telling, illustrate the danger. And then he ends with the warning that matters most. Do not allow it piece by piece. That phrase, piece by piece, should ring in your ears because that is exactly how freedom gets lost. Nobody wakes up and says, today we will be North Korea. It happens through polite incrementalism. It happens through bureaucratic creep. It happens through laws marketed as safety that morph into leverage. And here is the part that should piss you off as an American. Raskin is not just attacking Farage. He is attacking the entire concept of a Republican-led committee, even asking the question, the moment Republicans raise censorship risks, Democrats do not debate it, they do not answer it, they do not say, here is where you are wrong. They just declare the question itself immoral. They call it an attack on allies. They call it extremism. They wrap you in guilt. That is the system saying, stop looking behind the curtain. And yes, I am going to say it. That is why so many people in this country are sick of the political class. Because the political class does not argue anymore. It performs. It farms outrage. It tries to win with reputation destruction instead of facts. And when somebody like Farage shows up and says, you can insult me all you want, I am still going to talk, it exposes the scam. One side needs you silent. The other side can tolerate disagreement. Now, do not misunderstand me. Free speech does not mean you have to like Nigel Farage. It does not mean you have to vote for him in Britain. It means you do not get to treat speech as a privilege that disappears when Raskin gets emotional. That is the whole point. And here is the last thing. Raskin tried to frame this like Republicans are helping dictators by questioning Democratic allies. That is dishonest framing. Free countries do not fear questions. Allies do not fear scrutiny. Only institutions that are sliding into managerial authoritarianism fear sunlight. If the UK or the European Union or any Western government is building tools that can be used to intimidate speech, then friends should be the first people to say, knock it off, fix it. Before it spreads. That is what Farage came to say, and that is why Raskin tried to drown him in labels before he even opened his mouth. So here's the question I want to leave you with. When a politician like Jamie Raskin hears a warning about censorship, why is his first instinct to scream pro-Putin and then pivot to Trump? Why not address the policy? Why not engage the substance? Why the smear first? Because the smear is the mechanism. It is how they train the public to stop listening. If you caught that move too, hit like, subscribe to Saha Explains, and tell me in the comments, do you think Raskin was trying to defend free speech here, or was he trying to decide who gets to speak at all?